Well, welcome everyone. I'm delighted to present Xiaoyun Yang's talk today, Tang Cosmopolitanism Toward a Critical and Non-Sinocentric Approach. I'm Hans Saucy, speaking on behalf of the Center for East Asian Studies, and also speaking as a great fan of Xiaoyun's work. While I was working on a recent project that has to do with the literary relations between China and its outsides, I came across the Berkeley dissertation that was the predecessor to this wonderful book, The Way of the Barbarians, Redrawing Ethnic Boundaries in Tang and Song China. And I can't tell you how much I learned from it. In particular, almost every page, when I turned the page, I discovered new examples that I wish I had found and was very envious of. There's got to be a word, maybe the Germans have a word for this, example envy, Beispielneider or something, work it out yourselves. But that's what I often feel, not only Beispielneider, because his examples are so well chosen and sourced in writings that are sometimes well known, sometimes not well known, but in either case looked at from a new angle, but also Theorieneider, right? Envy of someone's theoretical framework, because he does have a very powerful and sensitive historical framework for explaining the dynamics of Chinese views of outsiders, of barbarians, of Yi, which wasn't a static thing. It's not like something that was set down in stone and never changed. It was terrifically responsive to changes in the political and cultural situation of East Asia, although never adequately responsive. I'll just give you one little quotation to give you a sense of the kind of thing that Xiaoyun is able to dig out and put in luminous contextual framing. He's writing here, he's quoting here from a person writing in 1044 about the Xixia, right, a supposedly barbarian land up in the north that was seeking to be recognized just as the Qidan had been recognized as a co-equal power in the universe, right? Another Tianxia, and in the Northern Song memorial written to Renzong, you read the following passage. The Khitans and Tanguts have acquired territory from the Central Lands. You know what the Central Lands are, of course, right? Drafted people of the Central Lands as laborers and soldiers, used the imperial title of the Central Lands, imitated the bureaucracy of the Central Lands, employed men of worth and talent from the Central Lands, read the books of the Central Lands, used the official carriages and court dress of the Central Lands, and implemented the laws and statutes of the Central Lands. Thus, whatever these two enemy peoples have done is equal to the Central Lands. Whatever the Central Lands have, they too have. What they excel in, the Central Lands cannot match. It's a fascinating passage because it voices in a tone of disappointment and anger and loss, something that in other texts is presented as a kind of triumph, right? The glory of Chinese culture is supposed to flow out from China into other lands and influence them and improve them. Here, those awful people outside of China have learned all the lessons and have indeed improved on what people of the Central Lands had created and have become a threat. For anyone who grew up in the United States during the 70s and 80s, when Japan was becoming, the country that everyone was afraid of, and for anyone who reads the newspaper every day about, the competitive, rivalrous relationship with China, this is going to have a very familiar ring, and it gives us a kind of a sense of the long range of history in which things are always dissolving and being recomposed. A kind of what I don't hesitate to call the Hongguan, the really sublime and epic understanding of the historian that is ready to watch everything be washed away and rebuilt. So it's a marvelous education to read this short, pithy, intense book, and I urge you to do the same. We welcome Xiaoyun Yang here today to give us another taste of his same medicine, watching how the local transmutes into the regional and the global, how the cosmopolitan and the provincial interplay. We're going to learn a lot, I'm sure. Welcome to Xiaoyun Yang of Denison University.
So, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much, Han, for inviting me to speak at the University of Chicago. It's an honor to be addressing you today. Thank you very much to Connie at the center for arranging my visit out here. And thank you all for coming, and I hope you're enjoying your lunch. So let me just jump into my talk without further ado. Now, so let me start first by explaining basically how I began thinking about the issues that this talk is going to be about. So about 10 years ago, when I was writing that dissertation at UC Berkeley, I began to notice the habitual characterization of the Tang Empire and its elite culture as cosmopolitan in English language secondary sources produced during the last 30 years or so. Such sources almost never try to define the word cosmopolitan, but they typically emphasize the presence of large immigrant or expatriate communities in the empire's major cities, and the metropolitan elite's taste for Central Asian music, art, and fashion. Now, often implicit in these works is an assumption that Tang cosmopolitanism reflected a spirit of inclusiveness, openness, pluralism, and tolerance that, more than the hard power of military strength and wealth, made this period both China's golden age and a contrast to later more ethnocentric, xenophobic, or inward-looking eras. Now, although I too had once taken the Golden Age mythos surrounding the Tang for granted, it's hard not to when you're growing up with that narrative of the Golden Age as a child. I began to realize that a thick layer of idealization, romanticism, and presentism has built up around modern understandings of the Tang Empire, not just in the popular imagination, but even among historians like myself. Now, since then, I've increasingly criticized the cosmopolitan empire trope for its tendency toward an uncritical, under-theorized, and over-romanticized understanding of Tang China. In this talk, I will be trying to trace the origins of this trope, to explain the reasons for its appeal, and to propose a better way of thinking about cosmopolitanism in the Tang context. At least I hope it's better. Now, it is now somewhat customary among people in my field to trace the cosmopolitanism trope to Edward Schaeffer in his book, The Golden Peaches of Samarkand, a study of Tang exotics, which many of you would probably have read. As Jonathan Scaff has noted, Schaeffer wrote about foreign people and goods with relish, which has served to glamorize the Tang dynasty. His ability to entertain readers has kept this book in print long after his death, and burnished the image of the Tang as a glorious and cosmopolitan age. End quote. But here's the thing: while Schaeffer certainly did much to popularize the image of the Tang as a glorious, to publish the image of the Tang as a flourishing empire filled with foreign merchants and fascinated with foreign luxury imports, he himself barely used the word cosmopolitan when writing Golden Peaches. The book's first chapter, The Glory of Tang, describes China's 8th century as, quote, the international age, the age of imports, the age of mingling, the golden age, which began to pass away at the beginning of the 9th century, end quote. And then slightly further down speaks of Emperor Xuanzong as, quote, the fabulous king, most glorious monarch of a cosmopolitan age, himself a connoisseur of the exotic, end quote. Now, that, however, is the only time cosmopolitan appears in Golden Peaches. Compare that to the word exotic, which, according to a Google Books search, which may not be very scientific, but seems to work, occurs 100 times in Golden Peaches. And the word exoticism, which is used 17 times. Now, in fact, Schaeffer seems to have drawn his influential interpretation of 8th century Tang as an age of openness, right? Followed by a turn towards xenophobia in the 9th century, from Arthur Wright's studies on the history of Chinese Buddhism. So here is Wright in a paper originally delivered to a conference of sinologists in Paris in 1956, and subsequently published in the Journal of Asian Studies in 1957. And the quote's up here on the slide, but I'll just read it out. After the Anlushan Rebellion, Tang's self-confidence and governmental effectiveness were not fully restored. The cosmopolitanism of the great days of Tang slowly gave way under the influence of barbarian attack and internal decay to a cultural defensiveness which occasionally broke out into xenophobia, end quote. Now, in Golden Peaches, Schaeffer cites this passage as his sole basis for reading mid-9th century Tang as, quote, a generation of fear and attendant xenophobia, end quote, that rejected and persecuted foreign religions, including Buddhism. Now, Arthur Wright would repeat the same claims in only slightly different wording in his book, Buddhism in Chinese History, from 1959, which is based on lectures delivered at the University of Chicago, right here, but drew heavily on the 1957 article. Now, it's worth noting that Wright only used the word cosmopolitanism once in each of these works. He seems to have assumed that his readers would understand it in the same way that he did, right, without him having to define what he meant, as an openness to foreign cultures and religions that was the exact opposite of xenophobia. Now, a similar understanding of the word cosmopolitanism is reflected in the other influential survey of Chinese Buddhist history produced in this period, Kenneth Chen's Buddhism in China, a Historical Survey from 1964. Chen made the following statements at the beginning of his chapter on Buddhism in the Tang. Though the Tang imperial clan claimed descent from Lao Tzu and thus favored Taoism, the central authorities pursued a policy of religious toleration, giving each religion an opportunity to develop. Nestorian Christianity, Islam, and Manichaeism all were introduced during the Tang times, and each faith found adherents among the Chinese. The cosmopolitan ideal was upheld by the Tang emperors because they regarded themselves as rulers not only of the Chinese but also of the barbarians. Now, here Chen went a little further in linking the cosmopolitan to a notion of universal rulership and multi-ethnic empire, and in addition to religious tolerance. But like Wright and Schaeffer, he used the word only once in the entire book and did not subject it to any kind of analytical discussion. So the first effort at defining Tang cosmopolitanism was made a full decade after the publication of Schaeffer's Golden Peaches. On the very first page of the introduction to a volume of conference papers titled Perspectives on the Tang, co-editors Arthur Wright and Dennis Twitchett identified what they considered to be the two key features of Tang society. First, as they wrote, was its eclecticism, the way that the Tang drew together the many cultural strands from the tumultuous history of the preceding 400 years. Second was its cosmopolitanism, its openness to foreign influences of all kinds. But one finds no examination of aspects of Tang cosmopolitanism in the papers collected in Perspectives on the Tang. Indeed, as Schaeffer, who was not one of the contributors, complained in a review of the volume, written in his inimitably and somewhat eccentrically literary style, the introduction, after a few kindly nods towards the Tang as a radiating center of civilization, plunges quickly into the sort of thing that clearly fascinates the organizers of this conference, of the conference that generated this book. The structure of government and the exercise of power. Other matters are regarded as secondary. They are, in fact, the pate that embellishes the tornado's Rossini, the gloss on the beef. In other words, the conference was heavily defined by Twitchett's interests in political, socio-economic, and institutional history, and lacked serious engagement with the romantic, exotic, and fanciful dimensions of Tang culture and literature that Schaeffer so loved. As a result, the significance and extent of cosmopolitanism in Tang cultural and intellectual history remained underexplored. Unfortunately, Schaeffer himself did little more to address this gap in scholarship, even though he took issue with it, as his research interests had shifted by this time to the Taoist poetry of the Tang and did not return to the subject of Tang exoticism, save for an article published in 1989, toward the end of his life, concerning the mysterious and perilous sea separating China from Japan. Now, greater credit, I think, for popularizing the standard characterization of the Tang Empire and its capital city, Chang'an in particular, as cosmopolitan, should probably be given to a number of textbook surveys of Chinese history that were written by Western historians in the 1970s and remained influential for decades afterwards. These were often like the first textbooks on Chinese history that I read when I was in high school, learning anything about Chinese history. For example, John Fairbank, Edwin Reischauer, and Albert Craig co-authored East Asia Tradition and Transformation, this is 1973, which echoed Wright in claiming that after the Anglo-Chan Rebellion, in their rejection of foreign religions and their losing battle with the barbarians, the Chinese gradually lost the cosmopolitanism and cultural tolerance that they had shown in the Six Dynasties period and early Tang, and became much more narrowly ethnocentric. Now, in fact, this is not the first time that such a claim had been made by Fairbank and Company. An earlier textbook co-authored by Reischauer and Fairbank, but not by Craig, in 1960, called East Asia, the Great Tradition, had already claimed that, quote, the open cosmopolitan spirit of the early Tang gradually faded into a narrower, more exclusively China-centered and introspective attitude, end quote. Now, There are other examples. Consider also Charles Tucker's China's Imperial Past from 1975, which clearly drawing much inspiration from Schaeffer, painted this picture of Tang Chang'an. So the quote is on the slide. I'll just read it quickly. Chang'an in Tang times was unquestionably the most populous, most cosmopolitan, and most brilliant city in the world. The resident population within the walls was about 1 million, and the city always thronged with visitors from afar. Horsemen from Mongolia, camel drivers from Central Asia, holy men from India, Arab traders from the Persian Gulf, Malay adventurers, and Korean and Japanese monks, diplomats, and students. Musical troupes, jugglers, acrobats, dwarfs, and blacks from distant realms amused the crowds at the city's fairs. Sing-song girls enlivened its eating and drinking houses, and exotic wares from much of Eurasia, as well as specialty goods from every region of China, were sold in its markets. The cosmopolites of Chang'an were fascinated by foreign things and adopted one outlandish fad after another in music, dancing, costume, food and drink, hairdressing, makeup, pets, and slaves. The same cosmopolitan spirit infected other Tang cities and left its mark on subsequent urban life in China. Now, similar characterizations of Chang'an can be found in Jacques Gernet's Le Monde Chinois, first published in 1972 and translated in English as A History of Chinese Civilization in 1982, and again in a revised form in 1996. Now, to Gernet, Chang'an was, quote, the center of a cosmopolitan civilization colored by the influences of Central Asia, of India, and of Iran. I have the original French up on the slide here, so I'm just reading from the English translation. And the meeting place of all the peoples of Asia, Turks, Uyghurs, Tibetans, Koreans, people from Khotan and Kucha, Sultians, Kashmiris, Persians, Arabs, Indians, Sinhalese. Now, in Genet's opinion, this invasion of foreigners, of elements of distant cultures, of exotic products, slaves, animals, plants, foods, perfumes, medicines, textiles, and jewels, could not fail to affect the sensibilities of the age or to enrich the Tang civilization with its new contributions, end quote. Now, Gernet, in the same book, used the same word cosmopolite to describe other cities. So cosmopolite in French, which basically would be cosmopolitan in English, to describe other cities, including Dunhuang, Yuan-era Beijing, and the Iranian city of Tabriz under the Ilkhanate. Again, in each case, this was accompanied by language showing that to Gernet, the key feature of a cosmopolitan city was ethnocultural diversity and a large population of foreigners from many different countries. It's also worth noting that Gernet, like Fairbank and Company, relied heavily on Wright's and Schaeffer's interpretation of the Tang after the Alishan Rebellion as xenophobic and anti-Buddhist. Now, to the extent, in the case of Gernet, of likening such sentiments to modern nationalism. Now, although Gernet described Chinese civilization in the first half of the Tang as cosmopolitan, he did not refer to the Tang as a cosmopolitan empire. The popularization of cosmopolitan empire as a description of the Tang most likely began with Patricia Ebrey's widely used textbook, The Cambridge Illustrated History of China, 1996, which titled its chapter on the Tang as exactly that, a cosmopolitan empire. Now, Ebrey described the culture of the Tang capitals, Chang'an and Luoyang, as enthusiastically cosmopolitan, and went on to list some standard examples. Buddhist pilgrim Xuanzang's travels to Central Asia and India, the presence of foreign envoys, merchants, and pilgrims and their religions in Chang'an, the fascination with foreign goods and fashions, the popularity of polo, an Iranian game introduced via Central Asia, the placement of ceramic figurines of Central Asians in Tang elite tombs, and foreign influence on the decorative arts, musical culture, and interior furnishings. Now, Ebrey's use of the phrase cosmopolitan empire apparently did not emerge in a vacuum, however. So using the Google Ngram viewer tool, I wonder if any of you ever played with this, I found that while the use of this phrase in published English language literature, as reflected in scanned text collected by Google Books, is still relatively uncommon. It has increased quite steadily since around 1996, right, which is the year that the Cambridge History of China came out for the first time. After about 70 years of very low usage, it's basically come back. Now, what explains the growing popularity of characterizing pre-modern empires as cosmopolitan in our day and age? I believe it is at least partly related to a much bigger increase in the popularity of the concept of cosmopolitanism itself among Western intellectuals since the end of the Cold War. So in Western academia since the 1990s, the idea of cosmopolitanism has taken on a highly positive connection with globalization, diversity, inclusion, and tolerance. It has thus come to serve as the basis for, I guess you would say, a non-Marxist philosophical ethical ideal of global citizenship that embraces the liberal international order, while rejecting the influence of ultranationalism, religious bigotry, nativism, and racism. Western historians with liberal or multiculturalist leanings tend to think of themselves as cosmopolitan, or at least aspire to be so, and to prefer living in hyper-diverse and heavily globalized, thus cosmopolitan cities. This has made it difficult for them to resist idealizing the cosmopolitan elites and urban centers of historical empires that they have chosen to study. In spite, I should note, of any post-colonial or anti-imperialist sensibilities that they might otherwise have, and without subjecting their understanding of cosmopolitanism to much analytical rigor or scrutiny. So the editors of a recent volume on cosmopolitanism and empire in the ancient Near Eastern and Mediterranean worlds, this was published in 2016, so not so long ago, offered an insightful critique of this tendency. As they write, the post-World War II and especially post-Cold War eras precipitated a resurgence of cosmopolitan philosophy and political theory. Positive arguments in favor of ethical commitments to all of humanity, the development of transcultural perspectives, and the establishment of universal, rationally grounded principles have elevated cosmopolitanism to a normative value incumbent on individuals, institutions, and states, at least in liberal democracies. And yet, the advocates of cosmopolitanism have only rarely addressed its historically intimate relationship with imperialism. Proponents and critics alike acknowledge the role of various forms of cosmopolitanism in the maintenance of American or Western political and economic dominance, while disagreeing on the possibility of recovering its emancipatory potential. Ancient historians have participated in this cosmopolitan revival without directly addressing themselves to these debates. The term cosmopolitan, however, performs little analytical work in ancient historiography. By this, they mean historiography on the ancient world. The label tends to characterize the openness of a culture to the commodities and ideas of outsiders, or simply its comparative diversity. It's almost always meant as a compliment, a sign that a particular ancient society practiced the same values we, the implied readers of such studies, espouse. In other words, they're very much like us, and therefore we should like them. The study of cosmopolitanism in antiquity is thus just disjointed. On the one hand, historians are producing ever more insightful studies on the politics of cultural difference. On the other, cosmopolitanism is invoked as a virtue without further examination of its role in the shaping of the imperial formations that gave rise to its theory and practice. So if I may add some comments to this really interesting quote here. Now, in effect, many historians seem to be assuming that an empire can't be entirely bad if its imperialism is cosmopolitan, because cosmopolitanism is an unequivocally good thing, and they too are cosmopolitan liberals. Therefore, rather than praising pre-modern empires as great on the basis of their military power and territorial conquests, as was the norm for much of the 20th century, I should note, historians who admire them for whatever reason tend now to glamorize them as engines of cross-cultural exchange and global trade, that is, as agents of early globalization. In that context, the Tang Empire's close association with the frequently romanticized idea of the Silk Road, a concept, as many of you know by now, I think, coined by a German geographer in 1877, has made it the perfect candidate for such glamorization. But, glamorization of the Tang is, of course, not a solely Western phenomenon. You find it very much in China as well. An interpretation of the Tang Empire as China's golden age originated among Chinese nationalist historians in the early 20th century, at a time when the long-held Confucian belief in an ancient golden age of enlightened governance by morally perfect sage kings, Yao Shun, Yu, and so on, was finally being rejected as mythic and ahistorical, as something that actually didn't happen, or we have no way of knowing if it ever happened that way. Now, the new perspective on the Tang was rooted in Western-derived and rather un-Confucian views on what made an empire great, namely factors such as territorial expansion and military might. The interpretation of the Tang as a golden age was suppressed as rightist in Maoist China, where the true golden age was believed to be in the socialist future, rather than in the dark feudal past. But it became entrenched in Western historiography and among Chinese communities outside the People's Republic, including those in Hong Kong and Taiwan. Now, reintroduced to the mainland in the 1980s, it has been increasingly politicized and promoted by the communist regime, which has moved away from class-based denunciation of feudal imperial dynasties and re-embraced the country's imperial past as a locus of nationalist nostalgia and cultural pride. So the Great Tang now features heavily in state propaganda surrounding the Chinese Dream ideology and the Belt and Road Initiative, which is billed as a revival of the Tang era Silk Road. as well as Chinese political discourse on the idea of a future Sinocentric world order, a fantasy embodied by the popular phrase 万国来朝, all the world's nations coming to pay homage and tribute. In recent decades, the image of the Tang as culturally cosmopolitan has also been popularized in Chinese society by popular media, of course, TV shows, movies, and so on, but also by reprints of Xiang Da's classic 1933 study, 唐代长安与西域文明, Tang Chang'an and Civilization of the Western Regions, as well as translations of Western works like Schaeffer's Golden Peaches. You see the cover of the translation by Wu Yigui on the right on this slide. Chinese historians frequently hail the Tang's relative success in integrating inner Asian peoples into a Sinitic empire, success purportedly symbolized by Emperor Taizong's assumption of the hybrid Sino-Turkic title Celestial Kagan, Tian Kehang, as an ideal precedent from China's modern official identity as a unified multi-ethnic nation in which ethnic minorities are improved and ultimately assimilated by the advanced civilization, in quotes, of the Han. But this ironic use of the idea of cosmopolitanism to promote nationalism and arguably a form of cultural imperialism, right, which cosmopolitanism actually is meant to be the kind of antithesis of, is not the whole story. China's increasingly repressed and isolated liberal intellectuals are also drawn to the popular image of the Tang as a utopian age of open-mindedness and intellectual pluralism, embodied by its ubiquitous association of the modern Chinese terms 开放, 多元, and 包容, and the older colloquial phrase 大气, which I guess I would translate as magnanimity. So conservative nationalists in China see early Tang society's fabled openness to foreigners and foreign cultures as a product of the supreme self-confidence and security afforded by military power and wealth. A strong China can afford to be open on its own terms, while a weak China cannot. The liberals, however, would prefer to credit the empire's greatness and strength to its openness itself, and use the Tang ideal to argue for more pluralism, freedom, and receptivity to Western liberal ideals in today's censorship-obsessed China. In other words, conservatives and liberals may disagree over what kind of political culture the country should have, but they share common ground in viewing the Tang, and the Tang from Taizong's reign to Xuanzong's reign in particular, as a model and precedent for it, such is the power and appeal of the Golden Age mythos. Now, in addition, China's feminists may now choose to use the similarly mythologized image of the Tang as an exceptional age of female empowerment and sexual liberation, to argue for the compatibility of gender equity with both Chinese nationalism and traditional Chinese culture. Now, early generations of Chinese feminists would not have done that. They would have based their arguments in Western liberal or socialist values instead, and seen Chinese traditional culture as basically too patriarchal to be salvaged. Now, so each of the treatments of Tang cosmopolitanism that I've described above indulges in a kind of presentism that oversimplifies, sanitizes, and romanticizes the Tang, as is generally the case, I would say, with any historical era nostalgically elevated as a country's or civilization's golden age. Thinking more comparatively and globally might alert us to the fact that the existence of significant ethnic and cultural diversity, or of openness to foreign cultures, does not make an empire inherently more benign or enlightened than an ethnic nation state. After all, empires by their very nature are built on military conquest and domination of other peoples, and frequently engage in selective appropriation of the conquered people's cultural practices in a way designed to symbolize their subjecthood and enhance the imperial elite's prestige. As I have argued elsewhere, every empire's cosmopolitan character has a darker side of oppression and violence that is usually most visible at its unstable, ambiguous, and heavily militarized edges, not at its political and cultural center. We too often forget that the Tang was no exception to this rule, and that its aspirations and pretensions to geopolitical preeminence and universal hegemony rarely went unchallenged by its barbarian neighbors. The empire therefore constantly had to assert and maintain its supremacy on various frontiers at great cost in blood and treasure, a cost paid not by officials and their families, who were exempted from taxes and conscription, but by the long-suffering peasantry, for whom life was never all that golden. Many of you probably know the poem that this painting was, that inspired this painting, right, by Du Fu. And the cost in barbarian lives could be heavy too. Throughout the dynasty's history, victorious Tang armies were known to pillage rebel cities, rebel or barbarian, often conflated indiscriminately, and massacre or enslave their inhabitants in a manner that the Han Chinese of today tend to assume was practiced only by Mongol, Manchu, or Japanese invaders. Right? The Tang was actually not very different. Yet many modern historians have mistakenly assumed that massacres of foreign merchants in Yangzhou by a rebel-quelling army in that 760, and in Guangzhou by rebels in 878 to 879, that this is the Huangchao Rebellion, were previously unheard of acts of xenophobia and a sign of the waning of Tang cosmopolitanism after 755, rather than part of, actually I would say, a long-standing culture of predatory violence in the Tang military. So the nature of our sources is surely part of the reason for our often insufficiently critical and overly state-centered perspective on the cosmopolitanism of the Tang. The Tang emperors Gaozu and Taizong established for the first time in Imperial Chinese history a bureaucratic office tasked with recording the dynasty's history as it unfolded. This innovation, adopted by all subsequent dynasties, has given us highly detailed records of the Tang court's activities and the lives and careers of its emperors and ministers. Now, these and the vast majority of other extant texts from the Tang naturally reflect a Chang'an-centered perspective, since they were written by officials and literati whose worlds did revolve around the imperial capital. Now, I should note that manuscripts recovered from Dunhuang and Turfan on the empire's northwestern frontier are the main exception. They have survived due to the dry conditions in that region, quite uniquely, and have enriched our understanding of life on the empire's northwestern frontiers. But they're still, way outnumbered by the Chang'an-centered source material that exists. So as a result, we have a much deeper understanding of elite life in Chang'an than for any other locality in the Tang Empire. But the absence of a similarly rich base of written sources from the empire's non-metropolitan and subaltern subjects, foreign vassals and allies, and internal and external enemies, means that historians have to make a special effort to understand their perspective and experience. For example, by reading Sinocentric and court-centered sources against the grain, noticing and critiquing the biases in their worldview, rather than assuming that it adequately reflects reality. In other words, one can better understand the Tang Empire as an empire by maintaining some emotional and critical distance from the Chang'an elite, and not empathizing or identifying exclusively with their point of view. By the same token, I would suggest that we can understand the phenomenon of Tang cosmopolitanism more critically and holistically by broadening our perspective beyond the culture, taste, and worldview of the Chang'an imperial elite, and situating it within a global historical context, rather than one defined by either Western sinology or modern Chinese national identity. So such a holistic approach would see Tang cosmopolitanism not as centered on and emanating from even the reputed cosmopolis of Chang'an and the exotic tastes of its elite denizens, but rather as a product of the whole empire's interactions with a complex constellation of large, overlapping cultural, religious, and economic spheres, or cosmopoli. Now, at least two of these spheres, and I basically kind of drawn them on this map for your reference, were a direct product of other projects of imperial conquest and expansion. The Turkic world of the steppes, which stretched from Mongolia to the Volga and the Caucasus, and the Islamic world, which emerged concurrently with the Tang Empire, and by 750 extended from Spain and Morocco in the west to Sogdiana and Sindh in the east. The evolution of the relationship between these worlds, the Turkic and Islamic worlds, from conflict to synthesis, is one of the more consequential themes of medieval Eurasian history. A more short-lived blending of the Sinitic and Turkic worlds occurred in the Tang, as has been thoroughly demonstrated by Jonathan Scaff, who interprets that blending as part of a broader Eurasian culture of imperial cosmopolitanism rather than something unique to the Tang or to China at the time. But there were also spheres of cosmopolitanism that either emerged without empire, in the words of Levan, Payne, and Weisweiler, the editors of the collection on cosmopolitanism and empire that I quoted from just now, or extended beyond and between empires. One important sphere in the latter category was the pre-Islamic Iranian world, which included the Sasanian Empire in what is now Iran, but also the states of Sogdiana before their fall to the Muslims. But also, in addition, the Sogdian merchant networks and immigrant diasporas that dominated Central Asian trade and extended deep into the Sinitic and Turkic heartlands from the 6th century to the 9th. Now, in recent decades, archaeological discoveries and new research have given us a much better understanding of the scale of the Sogdian presence in Inner Asia and China during these centuries, as well as its role as a carrier of aesthetic and religious cultures from the pre-Islamic Iranian civilizational sphere to the Sinitic and Turkic worlds. This constellation of cosmopoli also included the increasingly interconnected Indian Ocean world of maritime trade routes ports and networks, with Iranians, Indians, Sri Lankans, and Southeast Asians initially dominating their respective zones of trade, but facing strong competition from Arab mariners after the 7th century. The Indian Ocean world, in turn, overlapped with much of the Sanskrit cosmopolis proposed by Sheldon Pollock, in which South Asian and Southeast Asian elites used classical Sanskrit literature, transcribed using a variety of Indic writing systems, as a common source of political and social capital from around 300 CE to around 1300 CE, so about 1,000 years or so. The Tang's engagement with this Sanskrit cosmopolitan order, in Sheldon Pollock's words, was minimal to non-existent. Only a relatively small number of Tang subjects, mostly Buddhist monks, mastered the Sanskrit language, either when traveling to India on Buddhist pilgrimage or by learning from Indian monks in China. And they used literacy in Sanskrit purely for reading Buddhist sutras, not works like the Ramayana. But the Tang did participate actively in a larger Buddhist cosmopolis, more recently proposed by Tan Sen. Right? This is his term, basically riffing off, I would say, Sheldon Pollock's term, in which traveling Buddhist monks and the scriptures they carried and translated used the Sogdian and Indian Ocean routes to connect religious communities within a space spanning from India, Tibet, and Tarim Basin to Korea and Japan. Now, finally, a scenographic cosmopolis. This is a term coined, again, with inspiration from Pollock's Sanskrit cosmopolis by Ross King at the University of British Columbia, or as others have called it, a scenographic sphere, emerged in East Asia from the 7th to 9th centuries, not so much as a product of Tang imperial expansion, but rather as an outcome of state building and political centralization in 4 states that successfully resisted or escaped incorporation into the Tang Empire while remaining within the Chinese tributary orbit. Now, in part through educational missions that gave them access to a classical Sinitic education in Tang territory, elite men from Shilla, Japan, Bohai, or Parhe in Korean, and Nanzhao in Yunnan became well versed in classical literary Sinitic and the non-phonetic scenographic script, even though they spoke mutually unintelligible languages. Besides using scenographic writing as a kind of scripta franca, as opposed to a lingua franca. Countries within the scenographic cosmopolis also tended to share political ideologies and institutions derived from the Tang imperial model, including state patronage of Buddhism and study of the Confucian classics. Due to the popularity of the Silk Road image and the emphasis on openness and multiculturalism, historians have tended to take cultural influences from the Turkic, Iranian, and Islamic worlds as the benchmark for a cosmopolitan Chinese empire. But I would say we should recognize scenographic cosmopolitanism, in which Chinese cultural influence flowed outward, as equally deserving of the label cosmopolitan. It certainly had a much more lasting impact on East Asian history if you look at later periods. If we understand a cosmopolitan individual as someone with the ability to cross cultural boundaries with relative ease, then the most important representatives and vectors of cosmopolitanism in this constellation of cosmopoli were traveling monks, merchants, scholars, and migrants of various ethnicities, not Tang emperors and aristocrats engaging in conspicuous consumption and treating foreign objects, foodways, and fashions mostly as symbols of social prestige. In fact, contrary to the popular notion of openness being the key attribute of a cosmopolitan empire, the Tang state more often sought to control and restrict human movement within and across its borders than to remove barriers to such movement. According to a late 7th century biography of Xuanzang, the famous pilgrim, he broke a law against leaving the empire when departing for his celebrated pilgrimage to India in 629. Now, less well known is the fact that such laws remained in force, remained on the books long after his travels. You look at the Tang Code, they're still there. Under Tang law, it was illegal for any subject of the emperor to leave the empire on non-official business. Basically, unless you were an ambassador for the emperor, you could not leave. Whether by land or by sea. It was also illegal for foreign merchants to enter Tang territory without government authorization. The Tang Code, issued in 652, states that persons caught crossing the frontier for trade will be punished with at least 2 years of penal servitude. Basically, a kind of slavery, but not permanent. With the severity of punishment increasing according to the value of the goods traded. If the value comes up to 15 or more bolts of silk, then the penalty is both life exile and 3 years of penal servitude. If a foreigner is arrested for illegal entry to trade, however, the case is to be reported to the emperor, and an edict from him must be received before the appropriate penalty can be applied. Now, this was probably for the sake of avoiding diplomatic incidents, but also investigating whether the foreigner who had illegally crossed the border was actually engaged in espionage. Was he a spy? If he was, the punishment was death by strangulation. Now, a category of expatriate Sogdian merchants known as Xingshenghu or Xinghu were the only individuals from the Tang state allowed to engage in cross-border trade on the northern and northwestern frontiers. So now you get a sense of why these guys were so important. And even they were forbidden to export silk from Tang territory. Laws banning the export of all or most forms of silk textile are found in the Tang Code and are known to have been reissued in revised form in 714, 737, and 780. Now, of course, there probably was private foreign trade in silk and other embargoed goods along the Tang frontiers in Central Asia. But any such trade was effectively smuggling, carried out in violation of Tang imperial law. This fact is almost never acknowledged in modern studies of the Silk Road, which tend to emphasize the Tang government's role in protecting and promoting international trade. Now, by 737, in fact, Tang law also forbade the transportation of silk to the Lingnan region, in other words, the region around Guangzhou, presumably to prevent its private export via the port of Guangzhou, China's primary link to the Indian Ocean world. These embargoes on private silk trade, which persisted throughout Tang history but were abolished under the Song, are best interpreted, in my opinion, and I have an article that's coming out with Tongbao later this year, hopefully, that goes more into this, as an effort at compelling foreign rulers to participate in Tang's system of tributary relations in exchange for luxury goods. In other words, you want silk, pay tribute. You'll get some nice silk, right? No, you're not going to get it any other way from us. So the markedly different elite cultures and aesthetics of the Tang and Song periods can be better explained by shifts in the constellation of cosmopoli than by the oft-claimed but mostly mythical shift from cosmopolitanism to xenophobia or ethno-nationalism, as some have claimed in the late Tang and Song. In other words, rather than persist in the sinocentric assumption that the only significant change was in the Chinese elite's attitude towards foreign cultures and sense of identity, we need to pay more attention to what else was changing in Eurasia around the time of the Tang-Song transition. The world was not standing still while China changed. The Tang did lose its Central Asian empire to the Tibetans and the Uyghurs by the beginning of the 9th century due to the collapse of its western frontier defenses during and immediately after the Yangshan Rebellion. But the fading of Central Asian influences from Chinese elite culture resulted from more complex long-term changes, most of which occurred actually after the end of the Tang. Some modern historians have claimed that rising xenophobia in the late Tang led to a rejection of Central Asian music, but the Yue Fu Zalu, a compilation of Tang musical lore written in the 890s, so very late, very close to the end of the Tang, shows no such change in attitudes. Central Asian music was still very popular. The frequent use of a few satirical new Yue Fu poems, I'm talking about a number of poems by Yuan Zhen and Bai Juyi, from the early 9th century as evidence for a turn against Central Asian music and clothing styles is actually illogical because the satire is aimed precisely at mocking these foreign fashions' continued popularity among the Chang elite, despite their potential for interpretation as ill omens of a barbarian invasion. So they're satirizing the fact that these things were still so well liked by the Tang elite. The Chang'an elite's taste for Central Asian musical entertainments probably disappeared only with the physical destruction of the capital and its great clans in the rebellions and civil wars of the late 9th century, after which it was practically impossible to preserve or reconstruct the Central Asian musical repertoire because no new musicians were arriving from Kucha or from Sogdiana. Now, Song elite society, here now I'm showing you the circles of cosmopoli in around the year 1000 CE. Song elite society did not inherit the Tang's strong connections to the Turkic and Iranian worlds, but those worlds were themselves being transformed by the eastward spread of Islam and by waves of westward migration of the Turkic peoples, out of the Turkic people's original homeland in Mongolia. So Turkic peoples moving out of Mongolia, wave by wave, into Central Asia and even further west. The Turkic world increasingly overlapped with the now coterminous Iranian and Islamic worlds in Central Asia, while ceasing to interact with the scenographic cosmopolis, except in the semi-scenographic kingdom of the Turfan Uyghurs. Now, to claim, as some historians have done, that the Chinese lost their taste for Central Asian culture after the Tang because of xenophobia or ethnocentrism is to risk essentializing Central Asian culture as something static and to forget that the Sinitic heartland wasn't the only place that underwent sweeping changes at the time of the Tang-Song transition. Whereas the Tang military presence in the Tarim Basin left virtually no trace culturally. Central Asia from the 9th to 11th centuries was profoundly reshaped ethnically and culturally by Turkic immigrants from the east and Iranian immigrants from the west. A Muslim dynasty of Iranian origin, the Samanids, ruled over Khurasan, Sogdiana, and Fergana in the 9th and 10th centuries, and promoted a new courtly culture in which New Persian, written with the Arabic script rather than previously Pahlavi, served as the language of elite writing. Muslim Turkic dynasties that emerged from the Samanid realm, namely the Ghaznavids and Seljuks, spread the new Persianate elite culture to Afghanistan and Iran, creating a cultural sphere that some scholars now call, again with inspiration from Pollock, the Persian cosmopolis. The Samanids themselves fell in the 990s to the Turkic Muslim Karakhanids, under whose rule Persian-speaking Muslim Sogdians and Ferganans adopted a new identity as Tajik, a Persian term once used, ironically, to refer primarily to Arab Muslims. The Sakha Iranian languages of Kashgar and Khotan in the Tarim Basin similarly disappeared after these Western Tarim oasis states' conquest by the Karakhanids, replaced by Karluk, Middle Turkic. So if all this linguistics is confusing you, that's okay. I'll just move on. Okay. So meanwhile, the 9th century Uyghur migration to the northern oases of the Tarim Basin, I'm talking about Kucha, for example, caused the permanent displacement of the Tocharian languages of Agni or Karashar and Kucha by Old Uyghur, written in the Sogdian-derived Old Uyghur alphabet. Now, Turfan, the westernmost point of substantial colonization by the Chinese, but also home to a large Sogdian community, remained semi-sonographic into the 13th century, so it's kind of an exception in this regard. But it also developed a unique mix of Sinitic, Turkic, and Sogdian cultures. As the capital of the Uyghur kingdom that extended north to Beshbalik, modern Jimsar, and west to Kucha. The Uyghurs retained the Manichaean religion of their former cognate until around 1000, when they converted to Buddhism, rather than to the Islam that most Turkic peoples to their west had by then embraced. Uyghur conversion to Islam did not take place until the 15th century under the rule of the Mongol Chagatai Khanate. Ironically, by then, the Chinese had begun referring to all Muslims as Huihui, a term ultimately derived from the ethnonym Uyghur, and originally used for Central Asians of any religion. In other words, the Chinese had begun calling Muslims Uyghurs, even though the Uyghurs were basically the last Central Asians to become Muslims. Right? Now, due to much of Central Asia's cultural reorientation toward the Islamic world, toward the world of the West, Turkic and Sogdian immigrants ceased to arrive in the Sinitic heartland after the Late Tang. The flow of these immigrants into China basically just dried up. Now, those who were already there had assimilated into the general population by early Song times. Why they did so after centuries of maintaining their ethnic and cultural distinctiveness remains poorly understood. We still don't really know why. But contrary to claims that have been made for about 20 years now, it is very unlikely to have been due to prejudice and persecution. Now, consider that Sogdian military officers remained prominent and numerous in the late Tang imperial guards. In fact, one study by Bi Bo, who's a Chinese scholar, has found that the number of Sogdian personnel in the Tang imperial guards actually increased after the Anlushan rebellion, not decreased. And also that Turks and Turkicized Sogdians, who had merged into a quasi-ethnic grouping known as the Sha Tuo, ruled 3 of the 5 dynasties in 10th century North China. Right? They must have been doing something right to be able to do that. Now, the Sha Tuo themselves appear to have assimilated relatively quickly into the Chinese population during the early Song period. They were the last Turkic military elite to play a significant role in Chinese political history. In contrast, the westward migration of Turkic-speaking steppe peoples gave them influence in the politics of the Islamic world and Eastern Europe for centuries to come. In other words, you have a much bigger Turkic footprint or Turkic impact on places further west, whereas it basically just recedes from the East Asian world. Now, Tang China's connections to the Buddhist cosmopolis remained strong to the dynasty's very end. The notion that the late Tang was anti-Buddhist for xenophobic reasons, which, as we've seen, was popularized by Wright and Schaeffer and remained standard for decades. In fact, you still see it here and there, even now, has now actually been discredited as a myth by scholars who have thought carefully and critically enough about this. In fact, the Tang court became more pro-Buddhist after the Anlushan rebellion than before. Emperor Daizong's pro-Buddhist chief ministers convinced him that good karma from the Tang dynasty's past patronage of the Sangha had allowed it to outlast the rebellions of Anlushan and also Pugu Huai'an from 755 to 765. And that continued patronage would similarly protect it from Tibetan invasions, which were becoming more and more frequent. Now, Daizong thereupon greatly increased the court's donations to Buddhist monasteries and extended immunity from corporal punishment, previously a privilege for officials and their families only, to monks and nuns throughout the empire. Whenever Tibetan raids were reported, he had monks recite the Indian esoteric Buddhist master Amoghavajra, or Bukong Jingang's new version of the Prajnaparamita scripture for humane kings who wish to protect their states. And he rewarded the monks richly once the raiders departed, because obviously it was their doing, right? It was basically because of their chanting that the raids had ended. So Amoghavajra was already credited with saving the town by performing tantric rites that supposedly caused Pugu Huayan's sudden demise in 765 on the eve of an attack on Chang'an, right, in alliance with the Tibetans and the Uyghurs both. Now, the Indian monks' status, so Amoghavajra was probably Indian in origin, although some accounts say that he was Saktian. In any case, he was not originally from China. Now, his status as a kind of imperial preceptor at Daizong's court perhaps represented the zenith of Buddhism's use as a protective and legitimating force in town politics, leading Charles Orzek to call him, quote unquote, the most powerful monk in Chinese history. And all this is in the late 8th century, after Anushan. So the town court continued to see state support for Buddhism as vital to the empire's security long after the deaths of Amoghavajra and Daizong. From 760 to 819, the court maintained a tradition of having a Buddha finger bone relic, normally housed in the Famen temple. Here's a picture of it, brought into Chang'an to be displayed and venerated every 30 years. Although Emperor Gaozong and Empress Wu in the early Tang period had also venerated the Famen relic, this practice took on much greater importance in late Tang times, as it was now believed to bring the empire a new karmic dispensation of peace and prosperity. Now, Han Yu's famous 819 memorial to Emperor Xianzong, which probably many of you have read in some setting or other, in which he denigrated the Buddha as a barbarian and called for the bone relic to be destroyed, is often taken as reflecting the xenophobic spirit of his age. Now, on the contrary, and for this you can check out my book, and there's more on that in there. On the contrary, Han Yu directed polemics against both Buddhism and Taoism, rejecting them as immoral and inimical to Chinese civilization, and calling for them to be proscribed. And his views were actually regarded as outrageously extreme and narrow-minded by most of his peers. Now, Han Yu's Confucian exclusivist views became more popular in the 11th century under the Song dynasty due to a revival of interest in imitating both his powerful prose style, his Gu Wen style, and his critique of ideological pluralism. But rigid Confucian exclusivism was never state policy in either Tang or Song, and it's simply wrong to project Han Yu's personal prejudices onto late Tang society at large. Right? So consider, for example, that when the Famen relic was rediscovered in the hidden tunnel in 871, where it had been concealed to prevent it from being destroyed during Emperor Wuzong's, actually very brief persecution of Buddhism in 842 to 846, Emperor Yizong enthusiastically ordered that veneration of the relic be revived on the same grand scale as before. Now, I'm going to just skip over some discussion of Wuzong's anti-Buddhist persecution because I think time is running short. But I would basically just note that it was basically inspired by his pursuit of immortality and by Taoist priests telling him that you can't become immortal until Buddhism is wiped out from China. What I will note here is that the Buddhist monastic establishment was hit hard by mass monastery closures and property confiscations during Wuzong's persecution, but it soon recovered fully after his death from elixir poisoning. Basically, he was killed by the same drugs that he thought would make him live forever. Right? It happened to at least 5, maybe 6 Tang emperors, actually. So thanks to generous support from his successors, most monasteries were reopened, and the vast majority of forcibly laicized monks and nuns quickly returned to monastic life. After the Tang, Chinese Buddhism continued to flourish, contrary to a once prevalent narrative espoused by Arthur Wright and Kenneth Chen, among many others, of its irreversible post-Tang decline. Now, Chinese Buddhism did lose its formerly vibrant connections to Buddhist communities and institutions outside the Sinographic cosmopolis, including Central Asia, India, Tibet, and Southeast Asia. Earlier scholarship tended to attribute this to Buddhism's decline in the Indian subcontinent and disappearance from Islamic Western Central Asia. But Tansen Sen has argued that past studies have overestimated the speed and extent of the decline of Indian Buddhism, and that the real cause for Chinese Buddhism's estrangement from its Indian roots lies in its increasing indigenization into popular schools and sects, most notably Chan, that did not rely on models and scriptures from India. So rather than China simply exiting the Buddhist cosmopolis, the Buddhist cosmopolis itself broke up into separate scenographic and Indic spheres that very rarely interacted via either translation or travel. So the Buddhist cosmopolis is not on this map because it no longer existed. It had broken up into at least two parts. Song Buddhism was thus significantly more Sinocentric or East Asian in orientation than its Tang predecessor. That doesn't mean that it was more xenophobic by any stretch. So like the Tang, the Song never participated in Sanskrit cosmopolitanism, nor did it have much opportunity to engage with the new Islamic Turco-Persianate cosmopolitanism, which would only arrive in China with Central Asian immigrants under the Mongol Empire. Sogdian diasporic cosmopolitanism, formerly such a significant presence in the Tang, had ceased to exist as Sogdians in both China and Central Asia underwent assimilation into different identities. But one could also argue that the Song was more, not less, connected to the rest of the scenographic cosmopolis and to the Indian Ocean world that the Tang had been. It's just that these connections were no longer state-centered and defined by the tributary system and by the culture of the imperial capital elite. Instead, they were shaped and sustained by a high volume of private maritime trade. In contrast to the Tang era, Song Chinese seafaring for commercial purposes became legal within certain limits after 989. It was also highly, so the year 989 is when I basically see the turning point, when basically private maritime trade was legalized. It was also highly profitable and thus became an increasingly popular profession in the 11th century, stimulating major advances in Chinese shipbuilding and navigation techniques such as bulkheads and the maritime compass that allowed Chinese merchant vessels to begin playing an active role in Southeast Asian and Indian Ocean trade. Contrary to the now popular term maritime Silk Road, you see that all over the place now, the most important Chinese commodity exported into the Indian Ocean, mostly for markets in the Islamic world under the Song, was probably porcelain ware. And ceramics would remain at the center of Chinese foreign trade until the English acquired a taste for tea in the early 18th century. So despite the existence of strategic and security-related restrictions on trade with specific countries, including the Khitan Liao, Dai Viet, what is now Vietnam, and Koryo, what is now Korea, the fact remains that Song maritime merchants could be cosmopolitan boundary crossers in a way that was never possible for their Tang predecessors. Some of them even resided in Southeast Asia, Korea, or Japan for extended periods. The restrictions themselves imposed by the Song state were hardly effective. The Song government had no official relations with Koryo until 1078 and prohibited sea travel to the Korean peninsula until 1079 or so. Yet illegal maritime trade flourished, and Song maritime merchants could even play the role of unofficial envoys from the Song court to the Koryo court. The existence of large foreign merchant communities in the southern ports of Guangzhou and Quanzhou under the Song, including many Muslims from the Middle East, is also well attested and by now very well known. So any claim that the Song was less cosmopolitan than the Tang therefore rests mostly on a narrow understanding of cosmopolitanism that privileges the imperial capital and the culture of its elite, as well as the popular image of the overland Silk Road. It should be noted that Barry Hansen, whose book on the Silk Road did much to debunk various myths about the Silk Road, recently argued that Song China was the most globalized place on earth around the year 1000 due to its extensive maritime trade through Guangzhou and Quanzhou. Now, in conclusion, and I'm wrapping up now, we should stop privileging the Tang form of cosmopolitanism as though it were somehow exceptional in Chinese or world history, while ignoring the existence of other forms. Nor should we fall into the trap of crediting Tang cosmopolitanism to the attitudes of emperors and elites, rather than the contributions of the people doing the actual traveling and trading. Now, let me just point out that in this painting, you can barely see the foreigners. They're all covered up by the dancers and the officials and all that. You can see the emperor very clearly, though, right? But all these foreigners are almost props. You can only see their faces a little bit, right? And I think that actually is kind of telling of the attitude of the person who painted this. So I believe a more balanced view of the Tang Empire's foreign connections can be gained by engaging more deeply with the histories and historiographies of other Eurasian regions and states, including new concepts of religious, linguistic, cultural, and literary cosmopolitanism that have emerged in recent years. So let me just mention that our colleagues in medieval studies have for several years now been advocating for a global Middle Ages as a corrective to the Eurocentrism of their field. But few East Asianists have taken notice of this opportunity for interdisciplinary collaboration. It is time more of us did so. Otherwise, our standard narrative of Tang cosmopolitanism will continue to reflect the limited perspective of the imperial court in Chang'an, one in which the emperor and his aristocrats and officials stand at the center of the universe. Somewhat ironically, then, narratives of the cosmopolitan Tang must become less Sinocentric and parochial and acknowledge more fully China's place in a larger, interconnected, and multi-centered medieval world of numerous coexisting cosmopolitanisms. And with that, I end my talk. Thank you very much for listening.